And, I gotta say, especially also with, like, media and stuff, K-pop Demon Hunters is, like, hitting records and, like,
Mm,
Korean movies that are popular now and stuff, and
mhm.
I grew up with, like, Long Duk Dong and Asians being made fun of, and so even
Yeah.
in media, we weren't
Yeah.
accepted, so it's a very different time, and I'm glad it's changing, but you're right, everything starts at home, and if my parents sat me down and said, "Listen, we are Korean, but it doesn't mean, that we're not American or whatever," it would have been, falling off a more shallow cliff.
Right, and even to have that conversation with you, right, as these negative media perceptions of Koreans are coming out to say, like, "How is this for you? How are you relating to this?"
Oh,
And
yeah,
to
they
feel
didn't
like
no, they
right,
didn't have the capacity.
of course, they didn't have
No.
yeah,
They
but
threw books at me and told me I need to go get straight A's.
yeah,
That's how I will be different is or be successful is,
right,
go get good grades, which
right.
I was not able to do, but
And so
anyway.
then that attunement so it all compounds, right? So
Yes. Yes.
the social will always hurt, but if there's a safe place to come home to process it, that builds resiliency. And when there isn't a safe place to come home to process it, you're alone with that hurt, and that leads to trauma.
And, I wanna end on this, the safe place to come home to as an adult is something you have to create for yourself, whether it is, as someone who is not in a relationship or in a relationship, it doesn't matter, we all need a safe space to come home to.
Yes,
Yeah.
agreed.
I'm John Kim, a licensed therapist who used to be a miserable fuck before going on a hero's journey and turning expired relationships into revelations. I use my story to help others come with you instead of at you, unrehearsed on purpose, because self help doesn't have to be polished or complicated, just honest. Listener, the first time I met Rebecca, she fell from the sky. She disclosed the topic that is one of the big topics in my new book. It's about transference, countertransference in therapy rooms, and having crushes on your therapist and vice versa. And so she was brave enough to come on. That's how we met. And then it turns out she has a specialty. Not only is she a licensed marriage family therapist, but she talks about attachment trauma. You tell us because we're turning this into a series, not only for you to school my audience, but selfishly myself as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What you wanna hear about the
What you
attachment trauma?
specialize
What I
in,
specialize in?
and then I'll tell them what the 3 episodes are gonna be, our series.
Absolutely, yes. So I specialize in working with people with complex trauma, which is mostly attachment trauma. And attachment trauma, it impacts so it's early relational wounding that happens oftentimes within the family, the attachment, as well as in society. So any attachment figures that a child is interacting with in society greatly impact us always, but more so when we're younger because of how dependent we are and we're still developing. We don't know who we are and we're coming into contact with who we are based off
Right.
of society. And so this wounding significantly impacts somebody's sense of self, so sense of who they are, their shame that they take on, as well as their nervous system regulation capacity. And so there's multiple ways that the nervous system gets dysregulated through this wounding, which we'll talk about in here, and as well as the sense of self. So I work with a modality called NARM. So it's a neuroaffective relational model, and we have what's called survival strategies. And a lot of these happen through shame identifications. So we get identified with shame. That's not really who we are. Plus, we have a dysregulated nervous system, and all of that causes a lot of chaos and
Mhm.
disorganization within the self. And then we're trying to find all these different ways to cope with this chaos, to maneuver through life, to experience
Yeah.
pleasure and stability. And it leads to a lot of other mental health challenges.
Yes, and so this is episode 1, and in episode 1, we're gonna explain the basis of attachment trauma, right? What that is, the core dilemma, impact on sense of self, like she was just talking about, and of course, our nervous system. And you've heard this because 'cause you're a therapist, how no child enters adulthood unscarred. I mean, who doesn't have attachment trauma, right? So
That's right. I do view in this day and age, especially with the way that society is structured, like parents are not supported well enough. A lot of our society structures don't have enough support. And so I don't think there's anyone who becomes an adult with no amount of complex trauma, but it's a spectrum. And so you have, like, over here, there's just a little bit, there's some wounding here and there, but it's mostly, some therapy is helpful, healing is helpful, but they are doing pretty well in life. And then the spectrum all the way on the other side is when we see really complicated personality disorders, is really
Yeah.
this really intense disorganization that happens from so much trauma.
Episode 2, we're going to talk about the 5 developmental capacities impacted by complex trauma as hypothesized by NARM, as you were saying: connection, attunement, autonomy, trust, integration of love and sexuality. And
Mhm.
then episode 3 is all about like how do we heal from this, right?
Yeah.
So let's get into the first piece.
Yeah.
Can we start by defining what attachment trauma is?
Yes. So attachment trauma. So when we're born into a family most often, and or we're given up for adoption. But we form attachment to our caregivers, right? We actually start forming that attachment in the womb. And that attachment, it comes from both dependency and love. So a baby is actually born with their heart wide open, deeply loving their parents and deeply dependent on their
Right.
parents. And they are expecting naturally to be equally loved back and nurtured and kept safe. And they need to be kept safe.
I think we're the most dependent species.
We are. Our brain is only about 25% developed when we're born.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And babies have the least amount of capacity to take care of themselves. Really, all they can do is cry to say that they need something. And so throughout development, we have this attachment to our caregivers that is based off of, it's how we're learning, it's how we're growing, it's how we're developing our own sense of self. Who am I? And it is through the safety of these relationships that we come into ourselves and have the capacity to be in touch with these capacities that we'll get into next in the next podcast around being able to be in connection and relationships with others, self-attune, have access for autonomy, going after what we want for ourselves, to trust and know,
Mhm.
have discernment around trust, and then have the capacity to love and integrate love and sexuality together. And so the attachment trauma is what happens when the caregivers are either unsafe
Mhm.
or there's needs that are going unmet. And, sometimes this is abuse and sometimes it's not abuse. It's just parents do not have enough support. They're overwhelmed. There's not enough time. They're working full time. They come back, busy day. They're stressed and the kids aren't getting that connection and attunement that they really need for that healthy development.
Yeah, also some of it I think is can be cultural. I grew up with parents who were just in survival mode, so they worked
Mhm.
all the time, weekends
Yes.
included, and so, this is in the '80s where you could just, go outside and play until the lights turned off or the street lights turned off.
Mhm.
So, I always tell people I was raised by pulp culture. My parents were never home. When they were home, they were great, but when they weren't home most of my childhood, so the trauma is absence. The trauma is
Yes.
not getting that, what I call emotional milk, and then
Yes.
also on top of that, just being just old school Korean, not a lot of I love yous, or you're good, or you're like, not a lot of words of affirmation or hugs, no
Yeah.
hugs. It was just like work, work, work.
Yes, and that is so traumatic, and that's the hardest. We would call that emotional neglect, and that feels really strong, and that's not in a way of like, "Oh, we like a report would need to be made," right? But the emotional needs weren't getting met. Children have a need for connection. They have a need for hugs and snuggles, and they have a need to feel delighted that their parents are delighted by them, to see them, and to be in that relationship.
Would you say that people, their attachment trauma, it differs on the individual, right? So, like, that whole idea of, like, 2 people going into war, one
Yeah.
person coming back with PTSD and the other one not, just because I had, emotional neglect growing up, the way that it manifests in me will be may be very different than the way that it manifests in my brother.
Yes, and we also typically look at siblings often don't receive the exact same parenting, right?
Right.
So you have 2 different personalities. I believe in the soul in each individual, right? You have 2 very separate souls who are gonna interact differently. You have different birth orders, and then oftentimes parents have different relationships with each individual child.
Right.
And so even though you grow up in the same family with the same parents, it is rare that a sibling will experience their parents in the exact same way that another sibling experiences those same set of parents.
So what we're talking about right now, is this tied to what's very popular these days, avoidant attachment, anxious attachment, disorganized attachment, the attachment
Yes.
styles?
Yeah. So I'm going to go over what is called what NARM calls the core dilemma. And NARM was created by a man named Dr. Larry Heller. So I'm going to speak to that, and then from that we get a part two of a core
Yeah.
dilemma that we see often. The primary core dilemma that happens is that a child is completely dependent on their parents for survival. The outside world is really scary. It's really big. We know a child really can't survive on their own. So they have emotional needs, they have physical needs, and they have a need to idealize the parent and believe that the parent has the child's best interest in heart and is there to protect them, to essentially believe in the goodness of the parent, right? And we see this in little kids the most, right? They just adore their parent. They think they're the best thing.
Not my daughter, but other kids, definitely.
And I'm curious to hear about your daughter, but I would say, she maybe feels comfortable to talk back to you, but there's still
Yeah,
a
of
looking
course.
up to you, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah. And she does, treat me different than her mom, my wife, right?
Mm,
So, she's all about mom right now. I'm just the monkey bars. I'm the play dad,
the
right?
play
So,
dad.
and I think it
Yeah.
changes, as she grows, but, yeah, she shows love to me in a very different way than to my wife.
Okay. Yeah, that's a little bit separate, but there is a different energy and attachment that happens between the mother and the father. And father is historically more play oriented.
Yes.
So in this attachment, when a child gets either mistreated or so either something happens that shouldn't be happening or something doesn't happen that should happen, right? So that would be like you're not getting hugs, you're not parents aren't delighted to see you. Maybe they're not feeding you enough. Maybe it could be a whole level of there's not attunement, there's not trust happening. When something happens that shouldn't or doesn't happen that should, the child is in a dilemma to either stay connected to themselves, and if they're connected to themselves, there's gonna be a natural piece of anger, right? Acknowledging this is not okay, this is not right,
Mm.
they're not treating me well. But if they were to do that, it would cause 2 things. One is that it would make them feel unsafe. This person is not protecting me and or they're actually hurting me. And this is the person I need to go to feel safe from the outside world. So that would feel psychologically unsafe. And the other piece here is that children genuinely deeply love their parents. It is a deep love, and to acknowledge that they're being mistreated or not loved in a given moment would feel like heartbreak. They could not handle that amount of heartbreak and sadness that they're not being loved by the people who they adore and love the most. That would just be psychologically overwhelming and way too much for a child.
I was reading on social media the story about this guy who it wasn't his daughter, but it was his, I think, girlfriend's daughter. He's in prison now because, this is so dark. I think he ended up murdering the kid, but the
Wow.
amount of the amount of abuse he did to the child, I mean, I couldn't even read it. Oh, it was just so sad. You hear a lot of sad things in the world, but when you hear specific stories,
Yeah.
it hits so hard, and so when it comes to children or, like, people beating up the elderly or it just I just can't even, imagine.
It's just this the degree of vulnerability is so much higher, right? They're
Yeah.
physically vulnerable, and then because of the attachment need, they're psychologically and emotionally vulnerable. So
Right,
they
right.
what happens is this core dilemma is I need to choose between loving myself and staying connected to myself or feeling safe in the attachment. And they will always choose to feel safe in the attachment. And the only way to do that is to disconnect from themselves and to shame themselves for what's happening. So they'll tell themselves that what's happening is their fault in general. There will be some splitting. So for anyone who doesn't know what that is, splitting is what happens in these dilemmas where we have to make ourselves bad. There's another part that remains connected to the self that knows that you're good and the other person's bad. And these parts of our mind, they fragment and it becomes confusing. We kind of go between I'm good, they're bad, I'm bad, they're good.
Right.
But overall, there is going to be a semblance of shame that there must be something wrong with me. This person who is so capable of love and so good isn't loving me. That must be my fault.
Yeah. And, listener, think about your own story and upbringing as we're talking about this. The revelation I had, that my parents were emotional neglectful is a new one. I mean, I didn't even realize this until my late 40s. I've always thought because my parents never hit me and they always, bought me cool things and they loved me in their way, I thought that I had such an amazing childhood. And
Yeah.
I did. It was just very lonely. And so I didn't realize until later how them being gone maybe have created mother/father wounds and all of the stuff that shows up in, romantic relationships, all your relationships, friendships, etcetera, so
Yeah, that emotional neglect of any kind, especially emotional neglect, is the trickiest sometimes to heal. Sometimes it's actually easier to heal from outright abuse because it's a lot easier to see when something's happening that feels bad. It's
Right.
easier to say, "This feels bad, so I know this thing is bad that's happening
It's
or this
addressed.
harmful thing," right? It's very direct, this thing that we're working on. Neglect, when there's just this absence, it's this bad feeling, but you don't know a child where this is their only experience, right? For you, like, the only thing you knew is that your parents worked hard and you were alone, and
It was normal.
it was normal. They would I'm assuming would they tell you that they love you? Would they say that?
I was gonna say Koreans, but I shouldn't say all Koreans, but
Okay.
my family, not so much. My dad was the functioning alcoholic, so when he was
Okay.
drinking, he poured affection, and he was very charismatic and loving. My mom is a stone. She comes from a very
Oh,
hard life,
wow.
so
Okay.
not a lot of I love yous or,
Okay. Yeah. So
maybe
even
maybe a few side hugs, and that's about it.
yeah, and even okay, so then even that was missing, right? Like the I
Yeah,
love yous.
yeah.
But that's just becomes normal, and there might be a feeling of something's wrong here. There's no way to know what it is. There's no way to know what's supposed to be there. And so then that bad feeling is gonna get internalized as there must be something wrong in me that this feels wrong.
Would you say, because you mentioned earlier that, when this kinda stuff happens, there's room for anger to form,
Yes.
and, I think one of my points in sharing that story about the guy who harmed the child, ultimately murdering, he was very angry, and usually people who have that much anger, their childhoods were fucked up. Like,
Yes.
there was a lot of attachment trauma in their own life, which has positioned them that way.
Absolutely. I mean, that's where we the term intergenerational trauma comes to mind, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, my view is that anyone who is abusive is that way because they have their own trauma. It's not an excuse for the behavior, but we can understand that that one man was most likely very dysregulated in his rage
Yeah.
because he didn't have the holding to learn how to be with his anger and probably had things happen to him that created even more anger without any outlet or processing of that, and then it gets misplaced. And
Yes.
again, I don't wanna take away that responsibility from the adult to learn how to manage that, right? It doesn't excuse the behavior. That's where, like, as we do our own healing, then we're breaking that cycle. Like, we're
Yes.
working, right, to not pass that down to this next generation.
Many of us, our parents misplace their anger on us, of course, and it's not for us to label our parents as monsters. It's for us to understand what happened, and why.
Right. Yeah. And a part of this, the healing process that I'll go into more in the third episode, but is holding both coming because a lot of people will stay either in like my parents were bad
Mhm.
or my parents had their own trauma and they did the best they could. And a lot of the healing comes from being connected to ourselves and the child that had needs,
Mhm.
including love, being treated lovingly, respectfully, and all the other needs that a human has that weren't met. And that anger and that pain is valid. That there was mistreatment or neglect and that is naturally going to create emotion that's healthy and we can be with that without splitting off the parent as just a bad person, right? And that we're and holding as well that that came from their own unhealed trauma, that they hadn't healed their own trauma and that came down onto the child. Both perspectives. It's really easy to get stuck in one or the other.
Yeah. Pull me back if I'm fast forwarding too much, but how does attachment trauma from childhood manifest in relationships as adults?
Ooh, so many ways. And I think we'll get into that more probably in next episode where we go through the different capacities, right? But one of the big things here is that the wounding is coming in relationship. It's coming from connection. It's coming
Right.
from love. So one of the quotes that Larry Heller will say for trauma survivors, which is a lot of people, he says, connection is our deepest desire and greatest fear.
Mm.
So
Yeah,
there's this push-pull of like, I want this so much
and I'm scared of it.
and I'm terrified. The fear, right, that comes up as anxiety, that can come up as avoidance. I see avoidance as like avoidant attachment is there's so much anxiety and fear that we get shut off even
Mm.
from the desire, right? It gets too big and then it's like, oh, that's way too scary. I
Oh,
need to
sure.
just distance myself, as well as anger, a lot of anger in relationships. Anger is pretty quick, it's direct. If you were to say something that I felt was unkind, I'd say, I don't appreciate you saying that, right? If
Mhm.
that's anger. The anger that we see in relationships when it's like, "Da!" It's loud, right? That like, that's fear. That's
Mm.
I'm feeling like you're leaving me. I'm feeling like you don't see
Right.
me. I'm feeling like you're about to hurt me and I'm so scared.
Yeah.
And so we see that this unhealed wounding and the betrayals that had happened in
Mhm.
childhood around
Mhm.
relationship come up in these fears where then we're not seeing ourselves clearly and our partners clearly. And it gets tricky.
We're responding to the chairs that are thrown, not where the fear that they're actually scared. A lot of it being tied to, childhood trauma.
Mhm. And then we have a lot of this component of the shame that gets taken on from the
Mhm.
childhood trauma, right? From that core dilemma, the child has to shame themselves. And so if a person hasn't healed from that shame, that self-shaming is a natural instinct when probably in general to protect still the hope of the relationship with the parents. Actually, I'm going to speak to that in a moment. But so we're holding on to shame in relationship to the parents, and they will have a natural instinct to shame to protect the romantic relationship. And so then if the partner says something or does something that they don't like, if their natural instinct is to shame themselves, then they might get extra angry
Mhm. Sure.
to protect against a shame response versus knowing that they're okay and being able
Right.
to have a conversation with their partner about it.
When you talk about healing shame, the word healing, I think is a little misleading because I don't know if it's so black and white. I don't know if we can, fully heal. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like shame is residue that, to a certain extent, will always carry. I don't know if it's ever erased or dissolved.
I would love to speak to that. So, is it ever completely erased or dissolved? Probably not.
Right.
But what we talk about from the NARM perspective is that these shames, they're called shame identifications. So, part of attachment trauma that is so harmful is the things that are happening, they're not happening just one time. It's not one time that your mom yelled at you and now you're traumatized for the rest of your life. It's a regular occurrence, right? That is happening. And so you learn to shame yourself about how you are being that the child is deciding is causing that harm to come out that at them. And through the therapy, when I work with clients with NARM, what we're doing is we're disidentifying from the shame. The healing work is called the disidentification process.
The untangling.
Yeah, so it's coming back as we come back into the core self, when we come back into that space, the shame dissolves. Now it's often, when clients get here, they'll be in a space where they'll say they feel confused, and
Mm.
that's because they've been so highly identified with the shame that it feels like they're experiencing themselves in this brand new way that feels confusing, and that's part of that shift that's happening. It's actually like a neural rewiring happening in their brain, which is pretty cool.
So let me ask you, what's the most powerful way do you think to heal shame? Is it in relationship? Right? Is it kind of this idea of I talk a lot about the corrective love and corrective love. I wonder if in that space, shame can be healed because you can't really do it by yourself. I mean, you can only take it so far by yourself. No.
I think it's both and. So, yes, definitely in relationship, and especially for people with a lot of this attachment trauma, they need some sort of relationship to start to shift. And the therapeutic relationship can be a relationship to help that. That's one of the reasons Like, I work very relationally with clients.
Right.
We're not just looking at their thoughts, we're really being in the here and now, and we're connecting, and how are they experiencing that relationship with me can start to shift things for them.
Can I just point out real quick because that's a reminder we all need. I think a lot of people think therapy just means going into a room and talking about your feelings, but your
Mhm.
relationship with your therapist can be healing, the relationship
Yes.
itself. And I think that's why I've always been waving this flag of how the therapist should be authentic and
Yes.
show up as you and, instead of this cardboard cutout,
I 100% agree. I don't think it can be healing if the therapist isn't, to a certain degree, authentic.
Mhm.
So when we're looking at shame, the core dilemma in childhood is to protect against the attachment and the heartbreak.
Mhm.
Child's dependent. The core dilemma in adulthood, we continue to shame ourselves, is to protect ourselves from the grief of what happened in childhood.
Hmm.
And there's still, we'll hold on to this hope that when we shame ourselves, there's a hope that we can change and we can be different, and then the relationship will be what we wanted. And sometimes people even hold on to that after their parents have passed away. It's not a logical hope, but it's just like, okay, through something, I'll be able to feel this love that I deserved. And in that hope and in that self-shaming, we are now completely avoiding the grief of what wasn't and what will never be.
Man, this is so, complicated and multi-layered.
It
I'm
is.
trying to take my whole thing
Yeah.
is bring it to street level. I'm trying to take what you said and really simplify it, but I don't really know if I can. I don't know if
Right.
it should be simplified, but because there's so many layers.
There's so many layers. I guess to simplify that, right? So when you're mistreated,
Yeah.
especially as a child, by the people you adore and are supposed to love you,
Mhm.
that mistreatment is naturally going to feel bad. There's naturally going to feel sadness. There'd be sadness and heartbreak. Our wounds with our parents are our first heartbreak.
Right.
But the child can't feel that. They don't have the capacity. So they disconnect.
Mm,
And in that disconnection, they're not feeling the grief. They're shaming themselves instead of feeling the grief.
right. Okay. And the grief later in adulthood is felt, you're saying?
Right. So through the healing process, I help people connect to the primary emotions that would have been there if they hadn't disconnected, if they hadn't shamed
Right.
themselves,
Right. Allowing
right?
yourself as an adult to feel what you didn't feel as a child because you
Which
weren't able to.
is grief and heartbreak
Mm,
and anger.
mm.
And in NARM, they call that the emotional completion process. So as we feel that emotion, that's how we're reconnecting to ourselves. And the shame, you start to disidentify with that shame.
How does all of this, or the struggle of this tied to us, numbing, running toward addictions,
Yeah.
right now I'm listening to an amazing book. I think it's called I'm gonna fuck up the title, Down by the River, All the Way to the River by Elizabeth Gilbert,
Okay.
and it's all about love and sex addiction, which I could also relate to myself,
Mhm.
and, it's just so powerful how it can manifest in that way.
Absolutely.
Something like
So,
codependency, love and sex addiction, all this other,
yeah.
all these other
So
things.
there's multiple things happening that I can speak to this here. So, let's see where I want to start. So first, in the attachment trauma, so in a healthy relationship with a child, they get upset, right? Let's say like they're really sad and they're angry. A mother would soothe and be like,
Mhm.
"I see that you're so upset and angry." And they they would attune that, do you want a hug? Do you want to be held? Once they calm down and be like, "Let's talk through what happened. Why did you feel this way?"
Right.
And that's called co-regulation,
Yeah.
right? And so that child is learning to, we are born without any capacity to regulate at all.
Mhm.
None. We are completely dependent on being soothed for our brain to learn how to soothe ourselves.
Mm.
And so for people with this trauma, they never learned how to
Right.
self-soothe.
Right.
So the nervous system doesn't actually know how to regulate through emotion, and it will get so quickly dysregulated.
And that's where you insert all the numbing, right? That's where you insert all the other stuff like food, sex, whatever.
So there's that, and then there's also shame is inherently dysregulating. We can only stay connected to shame for a few moments before we will disconnect.
Mm.
And if the caveat to shame is to grieve, but that grief feels way too overwhelming to a system that doesn't know how to regulate and be with sadness and grief, then we have to get so far away from ourselves to just feel okay at all, which then leads to all the numbing behaviors.
Once we realize this, right, and I guess this is all gonna be in episode 3, once we realize, "Oh, I'm running toward," whether it's that donut or sex or drugs or whatever, because I'm actually not able to feel things, and it's because I'm not used to it because as a child, I wasn't provided that space. Then the work would be to actually not reach for the donut, but actually to sit and feel, correct?
Mhm. Or we can reach for the donut knowing what we're doing, right? So there's what we call agency is being in relationship to the choices we're making and then making those choices intentionally. So
Mhm.
it's okay to reach if you know that you're feeling emotionally overwhelmed and that donut is gonna soothe you,
Yeah.
you can have a moment of like, "Okay, I'm feeling emotionally overwhelmed. I know I don't need the donut, and I can choose to be with my feelings, or I can choose to eat the donut." And then you'll be like, "You know what? Right now, I have a lot to do. I'm gonna eat the donut." That's okay because it was made in choice.
Right, right, right.
Right,
Or
I don't have
I could
I
eat
don't
the
have
donut
time.
and feel something. Why can't you eat
Right,
the donut and feel something? It's the same.
exactly, exactly. Right, you can eat the donut and feel something, however we're going towards that, but it's just knowing what's going on, right? That you know, like, I'm not actually wanting a donut, I'm wanting soothing. I'm feeling
Mhm.
overwhelmed.
So what you're saying is the understanding yourself is the important piece, not
Yes.
right? That's the
If eating a donut is problematic, now we're using donut let's say it was cocaine,
yeah,
right? So there's a donut is a little bit more,
normalized. Unless it's
yeah,
12 donuts.
unless it's 12 donuts, and it can become binge eating,
Sure,
right?
sure.
And I actually also specialize in eating disorders, so I do work with that as well. That's a lot of binge eating is nervous system regulation.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
being overwhelmed and feeling that the eating will help with soothing.
The hi well, also you get a high off it. I mean, it's
It's
pleasure.
a lot of things. It's actually and it's dissociative. So
Yes.
in a binge eating episode, they're disconnecting, they're getting nourishment or food. They're usually really hungry. I've been restricting, but it also is being used to regulate the nervous system. We actually regulate quite a bit through food. So that's a whole other topic,
Yeah.
right? But even if it's
But
alcohol,
it's
detoxing,
another
no.
topic, but it still relates. The
It
process
is,
is still the yeah,
absolutely, it
yeah.
still relates, yes, and there's this idea of agency and awareness, and we can't make a better choice until we're in awareness, but I also work with people on not shaming themselves for their choices, right? So if they want a glass of wine and they know, like, "Okay, there's actually a lot of sadness in me, and I'm reaching for the glass of wine," they still have the choice to reach for the glass of wine. And it's
Mhm.
if they know, "Okay, that this feels like too much. I'm not ready to make this choice to sit with my grief tonight. I'm gonna drink a glass of wine." We can just be with that because that's what it is, and they're making the choice versus choosing the wine and then shaming themselves.
Right, so
"Oh my
you're
god, I made the wrong choice, and I'm so bad," and it can just
yeah, you're talking about self-love. You're talking about self-compassion. You're talking
yeah,
about, giving yourself permission, because if you don't, then you may forego the glass of wine, but then there might be shame behind it. Or you might have the glass of wine and there might be shame behind that. So almost like giving yourself permission to do it so you don't just compounding shame. You're not just compounding
right.
shame.
We don't wanna be, like, shaming ourselves
For anything, yeah.
for everything, right? It's having this understanding and being in agency, being in choice, being in relationship to what we're choosing. And a lot of these coping mechanisms are not in choice. They're not in agency. People reach for food and alcohol and drugs and shopping and our TikTok, right? I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
anything to disengage
sure.
from the self unconsciously. It just feels like, oh, this is what I need. And there's not a thought of, oh, I actually might have a lot of emotion that's coming up for me that I'm trying to escape from. The awareness gives us choice, and we can only make better decisions from choice,
Mhm,
right?
mhm, mhm. I think this is a great place to end because it
Yeah,
sounds like a cliffhanger because
it does.
I
Yes,
want more and hopefully, the listener wants more too. You know what I love about this conversation is I don't know who cannot relate to this. Like, I don't
right.
know anyone who grew up in a way where this just sounds foreign. You know what
Yes,
I'm saying?
I
Like,
agree.
you're
I agree.
human, you're an adult, chances
Yes,
are you're going to relate to what we're talking about. You're going to be like, "Oh, there's some dots to be connected. Oh, yeah, I may not have been abused physically, but yes, there has been attachment trauma in my life for sure. And if it's not with parents, then maybe it's with friends, or maybe it's with, early, boyfriends, girlfriends, crushes, like all of that.
Yes,
Yeah.
peer trauma happens as well, right?
Yeah.
And especially when there aren't parents to help support the understanding of bullying, right? So there's the trauma, and then when there's no support around negative experiences, that trauma compounds. That's another thing we can go into more in the next episode.
Yeah, and let me tell you how subtle trauma can be. So when I came to America at age 3, I just wanted to fit in, and, there were no Asians where we lived, for miles. We were, like, the only Asians, and I just wanted to be American. I was embarrassed to be Korean because Koreans weren't, cool at the time, and so if I had an American girl like me, it meant that I was accepted. So I was so desperate for an American girl to like me, and, hence the first imprint, right? And the more that I got rejected by an American girl, and at that time in that neighborhood, blonde hair, blue eyes, the more shame I had and the more I felt like, "Oh, I'm different. I don't belong here." The internalization of that. And it wasn't until later that I realized that's why a lot of times I put so much on, chasing the prettiest girl in the room, or just on women in general, because of their acceptance of me means that I have worth.
Yeah, and not to, like, focus too much on you, but because you're bringing this in,
You can focus
I'm
on
hold
me all you want.
I'm holding too, right, that part of this was that emotional neglect from your parents. If you
Mm,
felt really loved and seen by your parents and they had held with you, we look different than everyone here,
right.
and that doesn't that doesn't mean anything about you.
Yeah,
And to
yeah.
talk through the cultural differences that were happening, you still would have wanted to assimilate, especially, to fit in as a teenager. That's part of adolescence, but it would have probably been a little bit less weighted than it was.
Yes, that's a really good point. And, I gotta say, especially also with, like, media and stuff, K-pop Demon Hunters is, like, hitting records, and, like,
Mm,
Korean movies that are popular now and stuff, and
mhm.
I grew up with, like, Long Duk Dong and Asians being made fun of, and so even
Yeah,
in media, we weren't
yeah,
accepted, so it's a very different time, and I'm glad it's changing, but you're right, everything starts at home, and if my parents sat me down and said, "Listen, we are Korean, but it doesn't mean, that we're not American," or whatever, it would have been, falling off a more shallow cliff.
right. And even to have that conversation with you, right, as these negative media perceptions of Koreans are coming out, to say, like, "How is this for you? How are you relating to this?"
Oh,
And
yeah,
to
they didn't
feel
have
like
no,
right,
they
they
didn't have the capacity.
of course, they didn't have
No.
yeah,
They
but
threw books at me and told me I need to go get straight A's.
yeah,
That's how I will be different, is or be successful, is,
right,
go get good grades, which
right.
I was not able to do, but
And so
anyway.
then that attunement so it all compounds, right? So
Yes. Yes.
the social will always hurt, but if there's a safe place to come home to process it, that builds resiliency. And when there isn't a safe place to come home to process it, you're alone with that hurt, and that leads to trauma.
And, I wanna end on this: the safe place to come home to as an adult is something you have to create for yourself, whether it is, as someone who is not in a relationship or in a relationship, it doesn't matter. We all need a safe space to come home to.
Yes,
Yeah.
agreed.
Thank you for listening, and, listen to episode 2 and episode 3 with, Rebecca Prolman, and thank you so much for, creating this dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad to have this dialogue.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you could, learn more about, Rebecca in the show notes, so you could follow her as she continues to help so many people. Thank you.